Hi, folks. Welcome to the webinar. We're just going to give it about one more minute till the last couple of people trickle in. All right, we seem to be plateauing, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today. We understand that everyone is busy, so we really appreciate you taking the time to join us and review this exciting update here at IMPLAN. Today, we're going to be going over the 2017 benchmark input-output tables that come from the Bureau of Economic Analysis and how they are incorporated into IMPLAN's annually released data for the United States. My name is Wes Morgan, and I'm one of the data developers here at IMPLAN, and today I'm going to be joined by Dr. Jenny Thorvaldsen, who is our chief economist and lead for data production. As is always the case with our webinars, IMPLAN will be taking questions on any of the content that you see presented here today. Today's presentation will likely take closer to the 50-minute mark, and as this webinar is scheduled for just 1 hour, we will ask that if you have a question related to today's topic, please utilize the question box in GoToWebinar. In order to access that, please just make sure that you have your control panel open by hitting the orange arrow on the upper left portion of the pop-out window. Our colleagues, Michael Neely and Dominique Hikes from the Education Services team will be answering questions as they come in via the question chat feature, but Jenny and I will also address some questions towards the end of the presentation. If you do ask a question and it does not get answered through the question feature of GoToWebinar or Jenny or myself, please don't worry, as we will be answering all questions via an email follow-up in those cases. So to provide a brief overview of what we're going to go over today, we'll first start with an overview of exactly what the BEA Benchmark IO tables are and how IMPLAN uses them. Then we'll discuss why IMPLAN's industry list or industry scheme differs from that of the BEA's and how we come up with our list of industries. And lastly, we will briefly foray into some of the newly released 2017 benchmark data and provide some examples to help put that data into context. So without further ado, I will go ahead and hand it over to Jenny.
Thank you, Wes, for that introduction. Is everyone seeing the presentation okay?
You are good to go.
Okay, thanks. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. So I'll kick off with just describing a little bit what the benchmark IO tables are and how we use them here at IMPLAN. The IO tables, so IO for input-output, as most of you probably know, the IO tables present a full accounting of all the transactions that happen between industries and institutions in a given year. And by institutions, we basically mean all other actors in the economy other than industries, so government, household, trade, things like that. So it includes pretty much all the monetary transactions like input purchases, payments of labor income, household spending, government spending, investment, trade, taxes, subsidies, and so much more. There are many uses of IO tables. One is just to study changes in the structure of the US economy, meaning when technology changes and industries change what they buy for inputs, and they'll maybe buy more computers and less paper. And that's a little hint for what we'll see later today. And things like that. They also, according to the BEA, they provide the framework for preparing the national economic accounts that are used for policy analysis, business planning, and other purposes. And then, of course, the main use here at IMPLAN is and other impact is impact analysis, basically, to assess the indirect impacts that a specified event will have on all kinds of things: industry output, GDP, employment, labor income, taxes, and more. And so knowing all those interactions between all the actors in the economy is what allows you to model changes in that economy. So our Nobel Prize winner, Vasily Leontiev, created the first modern day IO tables for the US in the mid-30s and 40s. Then responsibility for creating them was transferred to the BEA, which published its first IO tables in 1964. Now the BEA publishes less detailed kind of summary IO tables every year. We at IMPLAN don't use those because they don't have the necessary details. So we just use the ones that they publish every 5 years, which are very highly detailed and have supplemental tables and things like that that come with it that we'll talk about today. And those are called the benchmark IO tables. So this happens every 5 years, and IMPLAN uses these tables as a base for the subsequent 5 years until there's a new benchmark IO table or set of benchmark IO tables. And I emphasize here as a base. We're going to talk a little bit later about how we update those values. So we just use them as a starting point. So keep that in mind. Okay, what do the IO tables consist of? They consist of a use matrix that contains values called absorption values. And those absorption values are the dollar value of input purchases by each industry. So it's basically the list of all the commodities, all the goods and services that each industry buys and in what amount. Analogously, we have final demand, which is the dollar value of purchases of goods and services by final consumers, so everybody else that isn't industry, as we talked about, so by institutions basically. And we also have value added by industry. So that value added in the BEA consists of employee compensation, so fully loaded wages, gross operating surplus, which is proprietor income and corporate profits, and taxes on production and imports net of subsidies. We also have the make matrix, which tells us what industries make and in what proportions. So it's basically the dollar values, and then we use them as proportions, but the dollar values of the commodities produced by each industry. And similarly, institutional sales, because some products are sold by institutions. So that's largely government, mostly government and inventory. Things get sold out of inventory, but households do sell scrap too. And then there's some supplemental tables like the redefinitions matrix and commodity margins. So redefinitions, we have a nice article for this on our support site if you want to know any more, but it basically moves some activity between different industries to better represent the activity that's really going on in the economy. So a common example would be a casino in a hotel. That activity at that casino needs to get moved out from the hotel industry. So all its output and employment and everything associated with the casino, they move it out from the hotel sector and put it into the gambling sector. So that's one example. And that way, even though it's one business, they're separating that business's activity into two industries to better reflect the type of activity that's really going on in that economy. And then commodity margins, that's important for any impact you're running where you're looking at household purchases of things, or I guess anybody's purchase of things that happen through a retailer, because we know the retailer doesn't get to keep that entire purchase price. They just keep the retail margin or retail markup, sometimes called, and the rest of that purchaser value will be spread among the transporters and the producing industry that actually made the product that was sold at the retailer. So that's really important. Okay, this is just to give you a real quick snapshot. If you've never seen the use or make table, this is the use table, just a tiny corner of it, just so it's visible, but they come to us in Excel spreadsheets, big old spreadsheets with industries across the columns. So the columns are the industries, and then the commodities are the rows. And this is just giving you a snapshot. We're basically looking at a handful of farm industries here, and you can see a snapshot of some of the things that they purchase. And these are, yeah, and then those are dollar values. And then here, I think it's in thousands though. And then here is a snapshot of the make matrix. And so it's flipped so that industries in this case are the rows, so they're along the left-hand side, and then the commodities are the columns across the top. So the main thing to point out here is you can see there's a nice clean diagonal line because each industry makes its primary commodity, of course. But you'll also note that there are a few industries here that are making more than one commodity. So you see that other crop farming, in addition to making other crops, also makes some logs and roundwood as a byproduct. And we also see that forestry and logging not only makes logs and roundwood, but also makes some greenhouse, nursery, and floriculture products. So just to give you a little snapshot of that. The primary data source for the benchmark is the economic census, which is conducted every 5 years at the establishment level. And the reason we point that out, it's very important and useful and good that it's conducted at the establishment level, because an establishment is a single physical location of a company. And so this solves the complications of vertically integrated companies. Each establishment in that company has its own NAICS code according to its primary activity. So think of 3M, which has buildings and plants throughout the US, and it makes all kinds of products. Well, a certain plant might make adhesives, and another plant might make paints. And there's another building somewhere else that is corporate headquarters, and it's all, you know, white collar staff. And so each of those buildings is its own establishment, and so it's going to have its own NAICS code. So that's really nice. And then an industry is a group of establishments with similar production processes, and a commodity is a group of similar products. The BEA does use a few other data sources for the input-output tables, some other Census Bureau programs listed here, other federal data from other federal agencies, and even one private industry, a private company that helps them with data for the insurance industry. Okay, now let's get to IMPLAN and the benchmark IO tables. So IMPLAN uses over 90 data sources, most of which are released annually. So we get industry output, employment, and GDP every year. We get household and government consumption expenditures every year, deflators, tax revenues, foreign trade of goods, and even more. But there's a handful of data sources that only come out periodically. One is the Census of Agriculture, which it is our only source of county level farm data, and it only comes out every 5 years. And then of course the BEA benchmark tables, which we're talking about today, that come out every 5 years. So we have 3 main uses for the benchmark IO tables. We really couldn't exist without them. And really no IO model could, but there's a few different ways we use them. One is for values for which there is no annual data source. So commodity margins, as we talked about, were one of them, redefinitions is one of them, and the make table. There's no other data source for those that come out any more frequently or anywhere else. We also use them to split some of our annual data into more industry detail. So foreign trade of services, our data source, the BEA annual data on that are at a more aggregate industry level. So we'll turn to the BEA to help split that annual data into more service sectors. And a similar thing for the BEA's annual gross operating surplus and TOPI data. They come at a more aggregate industry level, so we'll turn to the BEA benchmarks data on those to give us, to split that out into more detail. We also, of course, use the use table. This is where the power of IMPLAN comes from, of being able to look at indirect impacts, is knowing those interactions between industries and what they purchase. And we update, so at the beginning I had mentioned that we use the BEA benchmark as a base, and so here we're going to talk about how we update it. We update those values in two different ways. So we update them based on annual values that we get for industry output, industry value added, final demand for commodities, and institutional sales of commodities. Okay, so we're going to talk about the two main ways we update the numbers. So here's the first way. Each industry's use values for all the commodities it buys, all its input purchases, are adjusted proportionately for each commodity to conform to annual values we get for industry output and industry value added. And so here I have put the output equation. Any of you who've taken IMPLAN training probably know this equation very well. But industry output equals the industry's intermediate inputs plus value added. And value added is those things we talked about before: employee compensation, profits, taxes, basically. And so this equation has to hold. And so if we get new values of output every year for an industry, and we get new values of value added for that industry, well then intermediate inputs, the sum of intermediate inputs either has to increase or decrease accordingly to make this equation hold. So that happens every year. We get those new data, and then we update each industry's intermediate inputs based on how this shakes out, whether they all need to be squished a little bit or made a little bit bigger. Now this changes for each industry. Each industry gets its own output values and value added values, so it gets smushed or expanded uniquely for each industry. But for an industry's purchase of all its inputs, those input purchases get stretched or squished proportionally. Okay, so it's still going to be in the same kind of pattern as the benchmark. But then we have a second thing that we have to pay attention to, and that's because we get new data on final demand for every commodity and institutional supply of all those commodities. So in this case, each industry's purchases of each individual unique commodity gets adjusted uniquely. And so this is where changes in, just in behavior and technological change and things like that can be incorporated, because everything has to balance. Everything that gets produced has to go somewhere, and all demand has to be met, whether it's through trade or through inventory, what have you. It all has to balance. And so that's where everything gets really updated each year. Okay, now I'll turn to the next topic of why IMPLAN's industry list differs from the BEA benchmarks. If we rely on the BEA benchmark for those input purchases that each industry makes, how can we have more industries than the BEA, and why might we have some industries, why might we be missing an industry that the latest BEA benchmark has? 3 reasons for this. And I'm going to talk about the first reason here next, and then I'll hand it over to Wes to talk about the last 2 reasons. So the latest BEA benchmark, which was just released a few months ago, has 402 industries, while IMPLAN's new sectoring scheme is going to have 528 industries. Why is this? Okay, well, there's 3 reasons we're going to differ. One is that we make the effort here at IMPLAN to use previous benchmark IO tables to split the current IO tables into previously existing detail. And I'm going to talk about that one in great detail in the following slides. We also add some industries for which the BEA has never provided production functions. And in particular, this is the electricity generation industries. and Wes is going to talk about that. And then we do lose some industries due to the loss of NAICS codes for them. So most of you are probably familiar with NAICS codes, but it's North American Industry Classification System is what NAICS stands for. And it's a way to classify establishments. I think I was talking earlier that each establishment has its own NAICS code. Well, that's what that means. And when a new NAICS code or scheme comes out, there may not be a NAICS code anymore for an industry that the latest BEA benchmark has. And if we don't have a NAICS code for that industry anymore, we can't at IMPLAN have that as an industry because we won't have annual data for that industry. If there's no NAICS code, we're not going to have Bureau of Labor Statistics, CEW, employment and wages data for that industry. And therefore, we just can't have it exist. So we have cases of all of these and this time around, and we're going to talk about them. So I'll first talk about splitting into more detail using previous benchmarks. I'm going to start by talking about how we would do it for how we do it for the use matrix. Okay, so I'm going to talk about it in words first, and then I'm going to give you some examples in tables with some fake numbers. So from a previous benchmark, we're going to calculate ratios of each of the two separate industries' purchases of a given commodity to the sum of their combined purchase of that commodity. So that gives us a split ratio. We'll see this in numbers in just a moment. Then we use those ratios to split out the current benchmark's combined industry, its purchase of that commodity into two separate purchases of that commodity for the two separate industries that we're trying to create. And then after we do that for the industries, we split the industries' purchases of commodities, so we get more industry detail. We also have to do it for the commodities because then the commodities are going to have more detail. So we're going to show you right now how that goes. Okay, so the first step I said was to calculate ratios from our previous benchmark. So this is true that in the 2002 benchmark, a few benchmarks ago, fruit farming existed separately from tree nut farming. And here I've put just a total fake numbers for the two of them for 5. We're going to assume that they just purchased 5 inputs, and it's these 5 here. And we've got some fake numbers of how much they purchased of each of those. And all I'm doing is creating ratios, and I'm saying, okay, it looks like between fruit farming and tree nut farming, fruit farming, their combined purchase of electricity, which would be $900, fruit farming is buying 55% of that electricity purchase. So of the combined fruit and tree nut farming sector, if you will, fruit farming buys 55% of that, the combined between the two of them, their purchase of electricity, and so on. And they each purchase the same amount of insurance. So between the two of them, they each purchase 50% of their combined purchase of insurance. Okay. So now we have split ratios. I have some ratios with which I can split this benchmark's combined fruit and tree nut farming sectors purchases of these 5 things. So step 2 is just to apply those ratios. So here's our new benchmark in yellow here, 2017 benchmark. It does in fact combine fruit and tree nut farming. We're going to split it out using those ratios from the 2002 benchmark. So I'm just multiplying the combined industries purchases by these ratios, and lo and behold, I now have 2017 benchmark data, but split out into more sector detail using the 2002 benchmarks split between the two. So you'll see that they both still buy, remember how insurance, they both spent the same amount previously, so you'll see that they both are still spending the same amount relative to one another. But they're spending more than they did in 2002 because we're using the 2017 number of $900, but we're splitting it using the 2002 number. So we're only using the old data to split between the two. So notice that the percentage use of each commodity has changed. So this still is reflecting any change in technology or just processes. And here, these are all, fake numbers, but you can see that both of these sectors are now purchasing more insurance. And you could say, oh, that's because the price rose, or because of climate change, now insurance is more expensive. Whatever it is, that would be reflected in what we're doing here. So that's kind of important to note. Okay, so that has That's splitting the industries. Now we have to repeat the same thing for commodities. So now we have these two industries. We've already split them, but so you'll see on the right-hand side, we've split them. This is just the same slide from the previous one, because it just has the red lines around it. But I wanted to point out with this red box that they're both purchasing one commodity called fertilizer. Well, that's because in the current benchmark, there is just one commodity called fertilizer. But in previous benchmarks, this was split out into several different types of fertilizer, like nitrogenous fertilizer, for example. And so we now need to, after we've split these two industries apart, now we need to split the commodities apart. And we do it in the exact same analogous way. We do have to, however, though, make some special adjustments to remove illogical input purchases. So, for example, in the 2017 benchmark, 29 industries purchased fruit and tree nuts as a commodity. But we know that not all of those industries really purchase both fruit and tree nuts. So a couple examples here. The roasted nuts and peanut butter manufacturing industry really purchases tree nuts, not fruit. So we need to go remove fruit from its purchase and add that purchase value to tree nuts. Similarly, wineries industry purchase fruit, but not tree nuts. So we have to go do some of these fixes and make sure that that's all making sense. Okay, the make matrix goes through the same 3 steps, so I'm not going to belabor it, just listing them here again. From a previous benchmark, we calculate ratios, but in this time around, instead of each separate industry's input purchases, now it's the production of a given commodity. That's what we're making ratios of. And then we apply those ratios to the current benchmark's combined industry production of that commodity, and we get 2 industries. But then again, after doing this for industries, splitting them, we also have to split the commodities they make because we want to keep the commodity detail too. And this also involves some special adjustments to remove illogical byproducts. So keeping with our tree nuts and fruit examples, I have to remove tree nuts from the fruit farming industry's byproducts because I want fruit farming to make fruit, not tree nuts. And so we reallocate that tree nut value, production value, to the fruit commodity. And likewise, remove fruit as a byproduct from tree nut farming industry and give its value to the tree nut commodity. One we just put in here for kind of fun is that we noticed that a lot of industries were making explosives, and Wes and I are like, what is going on here? And it's because in the latest benchmark, explosives is included in a more aggregate industry or commodity called other miscellaneous chemical products. And so we needed to make sure that no industry that should not be making explosives would be making them. And then finally, we have to perform these same type of splits to all the other IO tables I mentioned. So final demands and commodity margins and redefinitions, everything. Okay, thank you for your attention to that. I'm now going to hand it back over to Wes.
Okay, thank you so much, Jenny. All right, so as Jenny mentioned, another way that IMPLAN differentiates its industry scheme from the BEA's is through creating entirely new production functions that the BEA has never offered before. So all the examples of this type of work relate to the electricity generation, transmission, and distribution industry. For all benchmarks that IMPLAN has used, including this new 2017 benchmark, the BEA has only ever provided just a single industry for electricity generation, transmission, and distribution. This singular industry doesn't completely satisfy the needs of our users, as both they and we recognize that the various types of electricity production make up a core part of the United States economy. As such, we break that single sector out into electricity power, transmission, and distribution as one sector, and then hydroelectric, fossil fuel, nuclear, solar, wind, geothermal, biomass, and all other electric power generation. To do this, we use several tables from the Energy Information Administration, National Renewable Energy Laboratories, and International Energy Agency. These data sources, along with some others, allow us to create distributors such that we can split out that BEA single sector into many. So that's kind of one of the main reasons where we differentiate there, is that rather than just one industry, we have 9. Additionally, our industry scheme differs from the BEAs because we require the use of NAICS-based data in order to be able to update industry information year over year. So that's exactly what Jenny had mentioned earlier. Basically, due to the scheme in which NAICS codes, those North American Industry Classification System codes, arrive in, some industries have to be removed from the IMPLAN scheme because there's simply no data to support them on an annual basis. A few examples of this from the most recent NAICS scheme release are gold and silver ore mining being condensed into one gold and silver ore mining industry, whereas they used to be separate, as well as hosiery and sock mills and other apparel knitting mills being combined into apparel knitting mills as just a single sector. Similarly, printing machinery and equipment manufacturing has been absorbed into the all other industrial machinery manufacturing industry, and storage battery and primary battery manufacturing have been combined into a single industry that's just battery manufacturing. Another example pertains to our retail industries, and that is that the NAICS for non-store retail disappeared, so we now distribute any data that we get for non-store retail in other sources out amongst all the retail industries that we have in IMPLAN. Overall, there are about 25 industries that IMPLAN lost this go round due to the changes in NAICS scheme only. So once we go through all the stages of using prior benchmarks to split the most recent benchmark and adding electricity production industries and aligning our data with the most recent NAICS scheme, that's how we kind of arrive at the new scheme for IMPLAN industries. That 528 industry scheme is under development currently. The upcoming release of that will be in our annual data for the year 2023, which will come out in the 4th quarter of this year. All right, so after we get our first year done, we will then turn to creating our time series data, which contains IMPLAN data in one consistent industry scheme from 2001 all the way to the most recent IMPLAN data year. Corresponding with the release of benchmark input-output data, we re-estimate and reproduce data set every 5 years. So there are a bunch of benefits to using this time series data and being able to have it to offer to our customers. But 3 of the most important ones are that 1, we get to have data with a consistent set of industries, commodities, and institutions. 2, we are able to use better raw data that has potentially been through revisions by their source makers and that is non-lagged or doesn't require any projecting by us. And finally, 3, the time series data also incorporates the current data production best practices. So what we mean by that is that IMPLAN is constantly seeking to improve the quality of our data through better estimation techniques and incorporating new data sources. And one of those that has been brought in over the course of the most recent 5 years gets to be incorporated across all years of the current time series data. So the time series production process occurs immediately after the release of our first data set in the most recent industry set. So the data team will begin working on producing the upcoming time series data at the start of 2025. Once complete, those data will be loaded into the IMPLAN tool for use in impact studies, but also will be loaded into data library. For those of you who don't know or aren't familiar with data library, that is basically an improved option for comparing data across regions and industries and time. Data library is an IMPLAN data product powered by Looker, and it allows users to produce data queries and reports with all the IMPLAN data available all at once. So it's perfect for looking at the time series data with. If you'd like to learn more about that product, information on that is available at support.implan.com as well. Okay, so now we're going to take just a brief look at some of the underlying benchmark data just to give you an idea of some of the improvements that it might make on IMPLAN data using a couple of examples that we would expect to see in light of how our economy has changed in the 5 years between 2012 and 2017, those 2 years being the years that the most recent two benchmarks were presented. So this screenshot contains some benchmark data showing purchases made by the automobile and light duty motor vehicle manufacturing industry in both 2012 and 2017, and they're converted into coefficients. So this happens to be one of those industries that was lost due to a loss of NAICS detail. So the 2012 column there represents a sum of the previously separated automobile manufacturing and light duty motor vehicle manufacturing industries. We've just added those together before calculating coefficients. And then the 2017 column has the detail for that singular industry, which is now in the current benchmark. So in this list of commodities, you can see that the coefficient for spending on motor vehicle gasoline engines and engine parts has declined a little bit, while the coefficient purchases of batteries has increased a little bit. I will note that it's okay to compare the storage batteries in 2012 to batteries in 2017, just because storage batteries were the only type of batteries available in the 2012 benchmark. So this trend kind of makes intuitive sense as we did see electric vehicle production gain a little bit more prominence over the course of those 5 years. So it's really just kind of about matching those expectations that we would hope to see with newer and more refreshed data. Another example of some of coefficient changes that make intuitive sense are around the rise of the smart device. So from the 2012 to 2017 period, we saw a massive spike in popularity of goods like the iPhone and Android smartphones and smart TVs. If we look at what the benchmark what the broadcast and wireless communications and equipment manufacturing industry was purchasing, we can pretty clearly see that electronic computers, computer storage devices, and computer terminals and other computer peripheral equipment were purchased in greater proportions than they had been. Of course, not every purchase of these types of equipment are going to go into producing those aforementioned devices. For instance, computers still need to be purchased for office spaces by this industry for use by employees and stuff like that. But this kind of large increase, that overall trend really jives with what we would expect. If we were to sum all of those coefficients that are listed in these two columns, we would see a 342% increase in the total coefficient between those 2 years. So definitely one of the larger changes that's going to be incorporated. Okay. Another trend that we might look at is the digitization of our economy. So tracking the spending on paper as a commodity, for example. The table on this slide shows spending in 2017 dollars, just so that these dollar values are comparable on the commodity of paper across every benchmark industry summed. So that's going to be that first row. And then it will also show spending on every commodity across every industry summed. So already, just looking at the dollar values compared side to side, it's pretty clear to see a bit of a decline in the spending on paper, even as total spending increases. But the coefficients are what we really want to focus on. That proportion of spending on one commodity over the proportion of spending on all commodities. So between the 2012 and 2017 benchmark data, we do see a decrease of about 32% in those coefficients. Once again, not all paper bought is going to be used for office documents and file folders and such. There are, of course, some completely legitimate examples of paper being bought for totally different purposes. But this example of raw data does also kind of align with what we might expect to see as we move to a more and more digital economy. All right, so as a fourth and final example, we did take a look at total industry spending on insurance as a percent of total industry spending. When looking at that, we saw an increase of around 9% between benchmarks. And that tends to be what we would expect as risk increases globally from forces like climate change, for example. Generally, we've seen basically assessment of increased risk on assets in many sectors. I will say that this particular example only represents industry spending, and that's what is coming from the benchmark. But these kind of trends are also going to be available to see in places like households. So if you were interested in looking at something like of insurance, we do have annual current spending data that we can look to, not related to the benchmark that IMPLAN gathers every year. And that could be used to compare across time and geographies. That kind of information is also available in our data library product. Okay, so now that we have been through kind of what the benchmark data is, how IMPLAN uses it, and then explored a couple of brief examples around it, we are going to go ahead and field some questions. So once again, if we don't get to your question here or it hasn't already been answered by Michael or Dominique via the chat box in GoToWebinar, we will be following up with any unanswered questions via personal email, so please don't worry about that. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and take some.
Yeah, I can start, Wes. I think we've been able to answer most of them in line here, but one that I thought was interesting was someone asked if this same sort of techniques are available for regional or state level IOs. And that's a great point that we didn't really talk about, is that the BEA benchmark comes to us at national level data only, but we do regionalization of those data as well. So when I was talking about how we update them annually with updated industry output and updated industry value added, updated household spending, and all of that, I was really referring to at the US level, but we get those same data, those same annual data at state and county and down to the zip code level every year. We get and estimate those updated values every year. So we'll get a full set of IO accounts, or also known as the SAM, Structural Accounting Matrix, for all of those geographies every year. So the answer to that is yes.
Excellent. Let's see.
Oh, go ahead.
Another one is the 2017 BEA benchmark dataset the most recent version available? If so, when should we expect the 2022 benchmark dataset to be available and integrated into the IMPLAN model? So the answer to that question is yes, the 2017 BEA benchmark is the most recent benchmark data available. It just came out a couple of months ago now. They typically release a couple of years lagged to the current year. So we would expect the 2022 benchmark data to come out sometime in 2029, which would mean that it would not be integrated into the IMPLAN data up until the IMPLAN data year 2029. So, and to clarify, I guess, a little bit further on that, the 2023 data that will be coming out at the end of this year, in the fourth quarter of this year, that is going to be the first data that incorporates this 2017 benchmark data and uses the 528 industry scheme.
Great, thank you. We did have some more questions about even more detail on the electricity sectors, like very specific types of wind, for example, offshore wind versus on land, for an example. And I'll just reiterate that we have to have a NAICS code for an industry. NAICS codes are the most detailed industry codes. And right now, and those come from the Census Bureau. And right now, they do not have a NAICS code that breaks out wind power generation any further than that. I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to that, Wes, at this point.
No, not particularly. Just that, yeah, we would need basically a couple of requisite pieces of raw data in order to produce something like that and to incorporate it into an industry. At this point, we would not be able to incorporate any new industries into the upcoming 2023 data. But were data available, certainly something that we could look into in the future. And then I would also suggest some of those data sources that I mentioned. If you were interested in looking into more specific types of wind energy, we can point you to some of those. We also have a great article on exactly how we broke out the benchmark data into separate electricity generation industries. So that is available on support.implan.com as well to peruse.
Thank you, Wes. One just came in about having negative taxes for a state. So we will definitely want to reach out to you directly just to look at your specific case. But in general, I can say that that category, so I don't know exactly which tax category you're talking about, what type of impact you're running. So we'll look at your specific case, but in general, that TOPI category, taxes on production and imports, net of subsidies. The net of subsidies is the key there, is that there are many industries, I don't know, many is the right word, but multiple industries that are subsidized, receive subsidies more than the taxes they pay in a given year. And in that case, TOPI can be negative. Similarly, proprietor income can be negative in some industries, in some years, in some places. And so that will result in some negative taxes due to IO models being linear in that fashion. So we can reach out for more information and give you more details in that, but in general, that's not a surprising thing that there are some negative taxes.
Yeah, so another question just came in. With each annual IMPLAN update, are the regional IO tables for previous years also updated? So the answer to that question in general is no. Each year that IMPLAN produces a set of annual data, we work on only that year's data. However, the time series data that we mentioned a couple of slides ago, that is going to contain more updated data for the series all the way back to 2001. So the last time that a time series data was completed was in 2018, I believe. So the data for 2001 all the way up till that data year was updated at that time. And like I mentioned, the next time we're going to do a time series is right after we finally finish incorporating this benchmark into our 2023 data. So we're going to start that in about 2025, and we should expect at some point during the year 2025 to have a release of all data where revisions and more recent data has been incorporated, and we can kind of back update all of that. So I see another. So based on the industries, there are chances for complete negative taxes, right? Yes, that is correct. We tend to see that a lot more in highly subsidized industries. So off the top of my head, thinking about the agriculture industries, farming is highly subsidized in the United States. And those often we see that negative tax situation that Jenny was just mentioning.
Thanks, Wes. And there was one more question for a little clarification on how time series data are integrated into the model. So they will be integrated into both the impact tool part of the model. So starting next year, we'll have a new set of each of those years, 2001 through 2022, new impact data for them. So new models with which you can run impacts. And then also they will appear in data library, and that's the kind of data visualization and exploration tool where you can do line graphs and mapping, and you have access to all regions, all years, and can really do all those comparisons. So they'll live in both places.
Okay, I see another. It says, we looked at the make use matrices from BEA. My understanding from the presentation is that IMPLAN makes some adjustments to that base data. Does IMPLAN make a data matrix or similar product with their adjustments available? I'm interested in use data to approximate sectoral dependence on certain sectors. So we do not have any kind of data product with our splits on the use matrix available publicly, but I would recommend that you reach out to your customer success manager, and we can definitely discuss that and coordinate potentially getting that to you or helping you out with that through them. If you don't know who your customer success manager is, then you can also just send an email to support@implan.com and we'll get you sorted out.
Talking about a question about looking at the make use matrices from BEA. My understanding from the presentation is that IMPLAN makes some adjustments to that base data. Does IMPLAN make a data matrix or similar product with their adjustments available?
Yep, Jenny, that's the one I just answered.
Oh, you did. I'm sorry,
yep,
Wes.
Yep.
I'm
no worries.
double tasking here. Sorry about that. Okay, what else do we have? Let's see. We do have some questions about farm data. I think that'll be one that we would want to reach out to you in person and talk a little bit more about that. So I mentioned that we use the Census of Agriculture, which a new one just came out this year. So that will be incorporated as well in our forthcoming 2023 data. That's our main data source for getting farm sector data at the county level. Annually, we get state level output values. Now, sometimes there's differences due to definition, because in IMPLAN, output is the value of production, not the value of sales. Those can be two different things depending on the industry. So value of production includes on-farm consumption of that food product, as well as anything that comes out of or goes into inventory, but wasn't sold, but was produced. And similarly, if farms are selling something that they produced in a previous year, that doesn't count as this year's output. So there are some definitional things there, but the farm sectors are definitely tricky for us to estimate because they are the sectors with the least amount of raw data. And so we do definitely recommend, as long as you're aware of how those numbers should be defined in IMPLAN and all of that, that you go ahead and edit. You can customize your model, and obviously you can customize your impact and make that look exactly as you feel it should look. So that would be our recommendation there. But if you have a real specific number that you'd like us to look at, you can reach out with more specifics and we'll be happy to look into it.
Okay, I see. What's the reason for having low taxes for IMPLAN 2022 compared to IMPLAN 2021 data set? So that I'm sure is just going to be dependent on your specific geography that you're looking at, whether something kind of moves up or down in between specific years. Our US data overall, we do control to NIPA, the National Income and Product Accounts tax data. So I don't believe that went down in comparison to the prior year, but we would really have to look at your specific area. And in that case, I would definitely recommend, once again, to go ahead and reach out to your customer success manager and let them know which geography you're looking at, and we'd be happy to look at any numbers that you're seeing.
Let's see. Are the make and use estimates adjusted by geography, or are those generally national estimates? Thanks for that question, Paige. These are definitely adjusted for regionality as well. So we just start with the national ones as our base, as our starting point. And then, as we were saying previously, we get annually updated values for industry output and industry value added, as well as final demands for goods, and all of that at the regional level. So we have state level PCE data that we use, and so we have household spending, and so we know that a specific, in this example, state has households that buy specific things. And so we have all this information on demands as well as outputs. And then we also get annual data on exports and imports. And so we have all this updated information on what commodities are being demanded and what commodities are being produced. And it all has to equal out. And so everything gets adjusted both nationally and regionally. We also have our regional trade model that gets estimated every year using those updated numbers on supply and demand of each commodity in each region. So they do get adjusted regionally. And you'll be able to look at that. If you look at a production function or the input purchases of an industry, if you compare to regions to the US's and just make percentages of them, you'll see that they'll be different.
Okay, C1, have you compared your industry partitioning with what NREL had done in its JEDI Excel spreadsheet model that measures the impacts for specific generation technologies? So the short answer to that question is no, but the long answer to that question is that we did use some data from NREL. It was not specific to JEDI or JEDI model. Essentially what we did was use data from NREL as well as the Energy Information Administration to partition out the BEA's values for fuel purchases and spending on power production, and then spending on all other commodities. So in that sense, I guess we have kind of partially integrated their data in order to make those splits. All the other commodities that all those different generation technologies purchase are also split, and we did that according to percent of power production relative amongst all different sectors. And then of course we also did some hand updates. So for example, the fuel source for nuclear energy production is uranium. So we allocated the amount that industry spends on fuel over to the, I believe it's uranium, vanadium, ore mining sector versus something else like fossil fuels and such. And once again, all that information is available in the article on support.implan.com. Okay, I think we'll probably have time for about maybe one more question, and then we will close the webinar. And again, if you do have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to your customer success manager or support@implan.com. And if your question was missed, we will certainly send out an email follow-up.
Yes, we will. Thank you, Wes. I'll take one last one, a follow-up one from Paige about the regional adjustments. How granular are they? Did they reach the county level or lower? So that is a longer answer that I won't be able to summarize totally. We have pretty much all of our data methodologies, sources and methodologies on the data methodology and sources section of our support site. We like to be very open about it, so I encourage you to go there, Paige. But the farther you go down in geography, the fewer raw data sets or sources you have. But we have, as Wes mentioned, we have to have a minimum amount of data to make a model for something. So we do have raw data all the way down to the zip code level for various things. It just kind of depends on the geography level, and sometimes it depends on the industry. As I was mentioning, farm sectors, we don't really have annual data at the county level, but for most other industries we do. So it kind of depends on the region and on the industry. So you'll have to just kind of peruse our methodologies and sources there. But if you have a more specific question, for sure reach out to your customer success manager and we'll be happy to give you more details.
Okay, well, that concludes our time for today. So thank you so much for your attendance, folks, and we hope that you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.
All right, goodbye.